thank you again. This is Ted Hicks from Late Night Parents. Ways to follow the show is latenightparents.com, where you can catch our latest blogs and our weekly podcast. We do a regular show on Sundays, and we do some specific podcasts on Wednesdays, but I've kind of flipped the script a little bit. One of the series I'm doing is called Basketball Minds, but since the NHL Stanley Cup and the NBA Finals are coinciding at the same time, I don't even know if it's right to even call it Hockey Minds. But I do have a great mind who knows a heck of a lot about hockey, because I got to tell you one thing, hockey is heating up in America, finally. Or should we say there's a resurgence. Both participation and attendance are up for one, and according to Harris of America's Favorite Sports, ice hockey today ties with men's pro basketball as the fifth most followed sport among U.S. adults. In fact, the National Hockey League has grown so popular in recent years that it's sold out more arenas than the NBA just a few seasons ago. Americans are even willing to pay 15% more on average to see an NHL match than a hockey match. So with rising attendance levels, TV ratings, revenues come to a new set of challenges for hockey stakeholders. For additional insight on the sport, the business side of the sport, hockey fandom, and more, we decided to invite Todd Bascom in our Ask the Expert segment. Todd, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good. And want to thank you for joining the show for this special edition podcast. You know what? We might even air it on our Father's Day show, but I wanted to ask you, because we've been talking about hockey for a long time. I think you introduced the sport to me many, many years ago, and I just had a fire about it. I got really interested, started learning some of the players, and at the time, I had a team, a professional sports team, less than 2 miles away from my home. I've got 6 questions for you, and I'll start off with this one. What are the biggest challenges facing the business of professional hockey today?
Well, I think today I'm going to go in a route that a lot of people might not. I think a lot of people will talk about how you expand the sport. I think for me, the issue is what are we going to do, or what is hockey going to do with its non-traditional markets? So it's particularly relevant now with Nashville being in the finals. And I live in a non-traditional market in Raleigh, North Carolina. You got a team in Arizona, Nashville, other places too. But there's a particular problem with these markets in that I'll go ahead and use Raleigh as an example. So we've got Nashville in the finals now, and the traditional, the kind of broadcasting team at NBC and people that go on shows such as me, and we're touting how great the environment is in Nashville, and Smashville, and this and that, the other. And you got Carrie Underwood singing the national anthem, and it's all people throwing catfish on the ice, and it's all fun games. And that's great, and it's bringing attention now. But let's look at Raleigh. 2006, when I moved to Raleigh, was the year that the Hurricanes won the Cup. And I think they had been in a final a couple of years before. And it was the same thing. I see everything happening in Nashville happened here in Raleigh. And that was fine. And hockey got super popular here in Raleigh, and transplants like myself were excited because we could go and see a professional team, and our teams could come into town. Me being a Rangers fan, I got to see them twice a year here in where I live now, and it's great. But something happened, and that something is the Hurricanes became garbage, right? So now fast forward 10 years later, I think it's been 7, 8 years in a row the Canes hadn't made the playoffs, attended to suffering, and now you're hearing these very real rumors of the possibility of the Hurricanes moving. So the question is, what's going to happen in Nashville when this cup run is all over, whether they win or lose, and Nashville doesn't make the playoffs for 4 or 5 years in a row, somewhere down the line? There's every indication to believe that they're going to be pretty good for a pretty decent amount of time. But as happens in sports, you're going to hit that rut. So what happens then? And I think the very real fear is you're going to see a repeat of what's gone on in Raleigh throughout the non-traditional markets if they even get good to begin with. So for me, it's how do we address the problem of the teams in the non-traditional markets catching and holding that fan base. I don't know how that happens unless they have periods of sustained excellence, which the Hurricanes didn't really have, and it remains to be seen if Nashville does. But that's an issue. I've always kind of felt like it was a mistake to come into these non-traditional markets before you had expanded your game in the traditional markets. And by expanding your game, I mean something relative to what you said, where it took maybe someone like me to introduce you to the game. Even us being in New York City, you have whole segments of the population that don't know, haven't seen, haven't played, haven't been exposed to hockey. They know it's there, they know it exists, but, well, that's for the other people. And that's kind of the attitude. And I think that it should have been expanded into the other segments of the population in the traditional markets before it moved on. So we'll see how this turns out. I think that eventually you're going to see some of these teams start to flee back to traditional markets. For example, the rumor is that the Hurricanes could end up in Quebec City. So, you might start to see kind of a migration back north, so to speak. So we'll see how that works out. But I think that's the biggest problem facing the sport from a business side right now.
Todd, what in your mind makes a good hockey fan?
Well, I don't know. I mean, as anyone that's listened to me talk about fandom for any length of time knows, is I don't care very much for fans in that sense. I think what makes a good hockey fan that I wouldn't complain about, I guess, would be one, get to know the game. One of my biggest beefs with the fan base here in Raleigh is that they don't really kind of have that knowledge of the game that they should in order to really understand what's going on. So learn the game, number one. Learn the terminology. All the strategy stuff, I mean, that can come later, and that happens as you watch the game itself and you begin to understand what you're seeing. Number two, be rational, which, fans have a problem with doing. See the Washington Capitals fan base for that. It's a typical example of irrational fans. But, and show up. But if you're going to be in Raleigh and you're going to be a Hurricanes fan, and that's great, don't run for them. Don't run from them because they're not so good now, and you'd rather watch Duke basketball. So that's kind of where I would put what makes a better fan.
So, Todd, do you have any tips for hockey fans on how they can enjoy the sport without breaking the bank? I mean, hockey tickets are much more expensive than NBA tickets.
Yeah, I mean, that presents a kind of a unique problem because most people that follow the sport or that have played like I have or watch it a lot, they'll tell you that hockey is a much better live sport than it is a television sport, and I've always found that to be true. So that does present a particular problem. Even here in Raleigh, the tickets are not cheap. You will spend well over $100 to get anywhere close to the ice, even here in Raleigh. Even on the secondary market, you can expect to spend that. But what I would say to hockey fans, though, is seek out other ways to watch the sport that may not be at the top levels. For example, in a lot of non-traditional markets, there's a lot of really good minor league teams, and the tickets tend to be reasonable. I know Orlando, I think, has a pretty good base down there, and I think they have a nice little market, and I'm told they really understand it and appreciate the sport there, and they're getting to see the Stars tomorrow in the AHL. Here in North Carolina, there's a AHL team in Charlotte, the Charlotte Checkers. That's the Hurricanes affiliate. So seek those things out, and you can go and watch some pretty high-quality hockey for a lot less.
So, question on safety and health. How does the NHL compare to the other major league sports in terms of ensuring safety and health of their players in the long term and short term?
Well, I don't know that I could really speak on how they compare to other sports. I do feel pretty confident in saying that I kind of feel like they've been a little ahead of the curve on that, especially as compared to the NFL. I think for the longest time, the NFL actually kind of had a denial issue where they almost didn't want to acknowledge that there was a safety or health issue. Hockey has always been very cognizant of that. I mean, you have a sport where it's not legally allowed, but it's tolerated that if two guys want to throw hands, they're allowed to do so. And you don't see that in other sports. So I think they're very aware of watching out for that. You also see what I think is there's a very good mechanism in place where the players kind of police those unsafe actions pretty well themselves. For example, and fighting is part of it. So I don't want to come across like I'm saying fighting is the key to maintaining the safety and health of players, but I think that you've always had these mechanisms in place in hockey to kind of ensure that things don't get out of hand in a sport where it could very easily happen. I just kind of feel that the players' own worst enemies are themselves, and you'll probably hear that in lots of different sports. Just from my own experience, I've had, I don't know, couldn't tell you. I mean, now looking back, I can't tell you how many concussions I've actually had. When I look back, I know I've had more than were actually diagnosed, and I can tell you that every single time I got my bell rung that way, I grabbed for my knee, or I grabbed for my elbow, or something, because I knew that I wanted to stay on the ice. So I think part of the issue is the players having to kind of look within themselves and say, all right, I need to go and get myself right. I know I want to stay on the ice, but I think a lot of that is going to have to come through educating the players to understanding that hey, I got to get myself out of here. Let the process take hold.
And this is Late Night Parents. We're talking with Todd Bascom about the business behind the NHL and the sport of hockey. Todd, one of our last questions is, what are the best cities for hockey fans? And I have a follow-up question to you. Can the Americas ever rival what's happening out there in Canada in forms of popularity?
Oh, well, I'll answer the first question. The best cities, I think the best city, bar none, is Toronto. And I say that for a couple of reasons. It's a large metropolitan area, not unlike New York City. It has a rabid built-in fan base. I mean, it's pretty much the national sport of the country in its largest city. I believe Toronto's its largest city. If somebody wants to correct that, feel free. But so you've got that. You've got the built-in rabid fan base, the size of the area in general. And I think Toronto has something that's unique to, I'm not aware of any other city that has this, and maybe you are. But so they've got the Maple Leafs, right? And they've also got the Maple Leafs affiliate, the Toronto Marlies, are right there in Toronto. So you've got the Leafs and the AHL affiliate, boom, right there. And so there's untold possibilities to watch the game. So maybe I can't get to see the Leafs. Well, I can go watch the Leafs tomorrow and go see the Marlies, and I don't have to go that much further to get it. I can still go downtown and see the Marlies. So I'm not aware. Are you, Ted? I'm not aware of any other city where they actually have their minor league affiliate right there.
Not aware of any other city, but you want to talk about a built-in fan base and
exactly.
those that can't get to or can't don't have the funding to see a major league team, then you can go see the minor league, which is just as great.
And that kind of ties back into the earlier question of what are the opportunities to watch the sport. I'm pretty sure the Marlies don't charge quite as much as the Leafs do for tickets. So that's pretty, and that can't even be possible in most places. Like, I guess you could do that in New York, but I'm not aware of any other city where you have that. Other cities, I would throw Montreal in there. As far as in the U.S., I'd probably put Detroit number one for a lot of the same reasons as Toronto. I mean, they just have a built-in rabid fan base. And they're getting a new arena next season, I believe. So that'll be interesting. Chicago, throwing it there. Now, what was your follow-up again?
The follow-up was, can the popularity of the NHL, where it is in Canada, can that ever be met or rivaled in the Americas?
Well, overall, I doubt it. Just on an overall basis, because I think, this is the same thing they always said about soccer. Oh, soccer is going to blow up any minute in the U.S. and it's going to take a while. I'd say the same thing about hockey in the non-traditional markets. But when we're talking about New York, Detroit, Boston, Chicago, I would go so far as to say the enthusiasm. I mean, you have 3 professional teams in New York City alone. You have 3 NHL teams in the New York metropolitan area. And they're all, last I checked, they're all doing pretty well. I mean, there's issues with the Islanders and Devils that we don't need to get into now, but the market supports them. and they have their own rabid fan bases in those cities too. So in those cities, yeah, I would put Detroit up against Toronto any day. I mean, you might give Toronto the edge, but it's in the conversation at least that Detroit is as good a hockey city as Toronto. So yeah, I mean, overall, I don't think it'll ever be matched like Canada, but in certain places, definitely.
Final question, and it talks about sports betting. Should fantasy sports site like DraftKings and FanDuel be treated as and regulated as gambling?
Well, let me answer this question by asking you, what's your short answer on that?
My short answer is yes.
Okay. Why? Just because you think it's gambling?
I think it's a form of gambling. I think
okay.
it's not as if you're just. I mean, there's some funding coming out of you on your end, and with the overall goal of, if you win, you're going to hopefully receive back more than you actually put in.
Okay, so you're looking at it as the pure nuts and bolts of the transaction.
Yes, I'm looking at the transaction side of it.
And I have a completely different take on it, even though my answer is yes. I think it should be regulated and treated as gambling, but I think that, but for my reason is, I see where you're going with the transactional aspect of it, even though I think there's a slight difference there that technically it's gambling, but not really. So I see where you're going with that, but for me, I have a completely different outlook on this. I look at it as we should regulate it as gambling because I live in a city or a town or a county where my schools need funding, my roads need to be fixed, my infrastructure needs to be improved, my water needs to be better, all of that. So why am I not going to grab the revenue stream wherever I can? So if you want to call that gambling, go right ahead. Call it gambling, tax it, regulate it, give me that money for my stuff in my home. That's the angle I think that it needs to be looked at from. And I think that it's short-sighted for people to say no. And I think the people that tend to say no will say it because they're probably involved in that industry and they want to put more money in their pockets. Look, I don't begrudge people that, but I look at it as a taxpayer. So where I want to call it gambling just because I want the revenue coming into my community. And I think that if people like us that have families, and so I think if we get behind it on that basis, people will start to listen. So yeah, let's regulate it. Let's everybody's going to get rich still, so it just becomes a question of how much is too much and how much is enough. But if it can put some more money in schools for my county, I'm all for it. Taxes to debt. And I'm good with that.
Gotcha. Well, hey, Todd, I want to thank you for joining this Ask the Expert segment and podcast. And definitely going to get you back on broadcast radio when we find out what happens with the results of the NHL final. Could be over tonight, but I don't think so. But we'll see.
All right. Nice to be with you.
All right. Take care, brother.
All right. You too.